Shalom, shalom. First, I want to start off by giving all honor, praises, and infinite glory to Yahweh, by Hashem Yahushua, by Hashem Kakudash. I want to give double honors into the elders, apostles, and bishops, the GMS Great Millstone, who rule well, teach, and edify, and peace and blessings to sincere Akim Wa'akwat in his household of faith. My name is Yeshaya, the young bro of the GMS Arizona Church, and Adawan Ratazah. Gonna make an edifying video, just going into medicines, really going into how really our true medicines are the herbs, and it's truth, brothers, understand, Esau Edom is he's counterfeit, man, and he's contrary to everything, he's trying to ultimately destroy you in any way that he can, all the way down to your dental floss, for example, like with your mouth, they tell you do mouthwash, something instead of doing mouthwash, you can make your mouthwash at home with fresh cloves and hydrogen peroxide, but dilute it in, by parts of water. So say you want to make 12 ounces of mouthwash, get you, a handful of cloves, and then get you dilute out of every 4 ounces, 3 parts to hydrogen peroxide, okay? And that mouthwash will do better for your mouth. It's antibacterial, antimicrobial, or antibacterial, and an anti-inflammatory, but the mouthwash they got here, that they got you taking is, carcinogenic, and it actually weakens your enamel. So we really, through the spirit, we have to abstain from those things. Even the toothpaste, man, the toothpaste that they got here is, ultimately calcifies that pineal gland, which can hinder the spirit. So brothers, get toothpaste that don't have fluoride in it, that don't have these harsh chemicals in it, and brothers abstain from those things. Medicines, a lot of the medicine, in Esau's system really is just a Band-Aid on top of a gunshot wound that he shot you with. We can avoid a lot of, bad things in life by simply, preventing it in the first place. High blood pressure. Sometimes high blood pressure, in some more extreme cases, it has to be addressed. But, before you get there, you can do certain things like strengthening your cardiovascular system. Your cardiovascular system, when you actually train and get to those higher zones of cardio, you brothers can search up zone cardio. What is zone cardio? There's some that are better for strengthening cardiovascular systems, and there's some better for fat burning, okay? Because it takes, it really targets fat instead of glucose, But what I'm trying to get at is when you do cardiovascular training, you get those zone 3 to zone 4s. Why it's so much better for your body and why it's so much healthier for your heart is that you actually are creating veins, You're literally building veins. You're, on a capillary level. There's arteries, there's major veins, but then out of those veins are lesser veins, and then finally you got capillaries, and why people that are, more cardiovascularly fit is really comes down to the oxygen that gets carried through the blood and delivered to all the different parts of the body. So someone that's cardiovascularly strong doesn't have to expend as much energy because they're able to get more oxygen all throughout their body as well, which, in turn helps their blood pressure. That's why, world-class runners, their heart rate sits at 40s, in the 40s, 40 beats a minute, and if your resting heart rate is in the 70s all the time, you out of shape. If your resting heart rate is in the 70s and your blood pressure is over, 130 all the time, and that the systolic and diastolic, that's the names of the blood pressure. The top number is systolic, the bottom number is diastolic. And that's the different pressures of what it represents is basically the flows. One's the in and one's the out, essentially. If that outer flow is bad, man, that can, be indicative of clogged arteries. And we understand that the food here is so screwed up. Jake has a diet of clogged arteries. So what do you got to do, man? You got to do cleanses. You have to go to the earthly things that help get rid of those issues in the body, man. Because if you turn to Esau Edom, he's going to give you a medicine, and his medicines are ultimately derived out of, things that are found here on this earth. but then he adds chemical compounds to it as well. You know, he took what's good that, he took the good thing that the Lord has established, right, and he's perverted it, in any way that he could. Let me get this. I think it's Sirach 36. Bear with me for 1 second. Because unto the wicked man, he's perverted these things. What's going on with my app? Salah, give me 1 second. Sirach 39. It says, the principal things for the whole use of man's life are water, fire, iron, and salt, flour for wheat, honey, milk, and the blood of the grape, and oil and clothing. All these things are for good to the godly, so to the sinners they are turned into evil. Now that is what Esau Edom has done, man. These simple things that are good to the godly, so to the sinners there's evil. These are things listed on the, here is a few things, but ultimately he's perverted everything, okay? For example, a cucumber, there's chemicals that get released whenever you eat certain things like ginger. They're anti-inflammatory because ultimately they're compound of molecules, and on a cellular level, they help with inflammation. There's chemical reactions that happen within eating these things. Esau Edom, the way that he gets these things, he extrapolates it out of a plant. For example, ashwagandha. Ashwagandha isn't just a magic flower that, magically you just start feeling more calm. That flower, what it's ultimately extrapolated from is a plant that has self-regulating tempos that help it survive in the wild. It has a self-regulation. Let me get let's just hit the chat real quick. All right. Ashwagandha is a medicinal shrub that uses for centuries traditional Ayurvedic medicine. Scientists don't think it works through just one pathway, rather it appears to influence several systems in the body. Let's see here. Let's see. Let's just make it simple. And we'll just get one example because we can go on about these things, man. All right, so in the wild, ashwagandha grows in hot, dry, nutrient-poor environments in parts of India, the Middle East, and Africa. To survive, it has evolved to produce a variety of chemicals, especially with knollides that help it cope with environmental stress. All right. These compounds serve several purposes in the plant: defense against insects and grazing animals. Every plant chemical tastes bitter or can interfere with the biology of herbivores, making the plant less appealing. Protecting from microbes, some compounds help reduce from the fungi and bacteria. So there's real legitimate chemicals, that these plants that are of the earth possess. Esau Edom makes it seem like his medicines are the only thing that does that. People in modern Babylon, don't consider that, this right here just looks like a fucking bush, but they wouldn't consider that bush, actually has, some real depth to it, if used right. It says, coping with environmental stress. It says the answer is coincides through evolution, not because the human plant wants to claim humans and plants. Yeah, shut up. The plant evolved with no hides for its own survival. And that's what Esau Edom really extracts from the plants. It extracts these chemicals from the plants and then it puts it, Esau puts it through his little labs and his science labs and he perverts it. And then all of a sudden you have that. But really, a lot of these plants you can just literally, make a tea out of. A lot of these plants you could legitimately just make a tea. And it keeps those chemical compounds within that. So that's why when you do, you get tinctures or you take the herbs, a lot of the herbs, you really have to, really make the tea out of it. It heats it up, and it releases those compounds because as it said right here, with environmental stresses. So you put that, herb under that stress, it releases those compounds and it releases it into the water. And it says right here, they they can taste bitter and infer with the biology of herbivores, so animals. So a lot of the teas that you see that are real good for you, those teas, are real bitter. You go to Dr. Bobby Price, he has a whole, tincture, for the Candida cleanse. And, man, that shit's bitter, man. It's real bitter. It tastes terrible, but it has legitimate effects because, ultimately those chemicals are in that. But Esau Edomites took these medicines and perverted it. It says all these things are good to the godly, but to the sinners, they are turned into evil. And that's just one example of how that works. Ashwagandha just isn't magically there and just magically works like that. It has a legitimate function. That plant has a legitimate way that it survives and does certain things, man. It has a legitimate means of, why it does that. The Lord is the ultimate power. He's cold. The Lord is amazing. So the way he's constructed a lot of things have legitimate purposes. Things ain't just made to just be there, A lot of things have legitimate, depth to it. But anyways, let's get that Sirach 38. In 38 and 4, it says, the Lord hath created medicines out of the earth, and he that is slack. I'm going to start up. Sirach 38 and 1, it says, honor a physician with the honor due unto him for the uses which ye may have of him, for the Lord hath created him. And if you're in this truth, man, you have to, you really got to be a physician, man. Brothers is like doctors, got a doctorate in holistic, health. Brothers will pose things to you and, that you can do naturally that'll literally cure things like, as far as kidney disease, cancer. You can solve those problems, firstly with the spirit and power of Yahweh B'Shem Yahweh Shai. It's all spiritual too, because ultimately Esau Edom has corrupted a lot of these herbs, so they're not as strong as they used to be. Okay, they're not as effective as they used to be. You can't rely on them as much as you used to be able to, back in the day. But, with faith, the Lord sees you rehearsing them righteous acts that you turn into the herbs instead of popping them Tylenol pills like it's Skittles and shit. The Lord will curve that, and also using the legitimate, functions of the medicine that we've been given, That's why it's important to really not be on that. And also, his medicines, the side effects are death, depression, suicidal thoughts, trip outs. Like, bro, they'll have a whole medicine that's talking about, yeah, we'll solve your mood swings, but then we'll also make you suicidal. This is that devil he is, man. You can't trust in his medicinal systems because I work in the medical industry, and I've had patients that would tell me how they would take Advils, real often, on a daily basis. And eventually, and Advil's a blood thinner as well, or not Advil, aspirin, and that a lot of people take those for like muscle relaxing, But going back to Advils, I kind of got them mixed up. But going back to Advils, they'll take them like every day because they just felt so bad. And then they said, they ultimately met up with their doctor and was like, well, you were taking Advils and now you got kidney failure because ultimately it just completely shot your kidneys. When you put your body under stress, when you rely on Esau Edom shit, man, a lot of stress, the thing about the herbs, it's a lot more gentle on your body. It's natural, that's the difference between trying to solve your weight problems with Ozempic versus, eating more fruits, being more active. Stop eating fucking burgers, fries, and wondering why you're not losing weight, It's simple things, man. We really have to turn to the simplicities in Yahweh B'Shem Yahweh Shai. But really going down, it says, the skill of the physician shall lift up his head, and in the sight of great men shall he be admired. The Lord hath created medicines out of the earth, and he that is wise will not abhor them. So we really have to be proficient in medicines, man. And get you a book on some herbs. That it's not off to read about the herbs. We get you a book to read about how these herbs work and look up videos. Brothers got videos. The apostles, every once in a while, they'll put up those gems. The apostle Gabar will put up the what's in my kitchen gem, and replicate that thing, man. The scriptures talk about mark ye the perfect man. So you see that, man, you see the apostles, which ultimately we learn from, we look up to, say, hey, start eating more of this, try this out. Get away from the seed oils, man. Cook with beef tallow. Put that whole vegetable oil bullshit down. Don't be eating fried foods. Apostle Tahar be like, you eat fried chicken, you going off. Okay? we adhere to this advice, and it causes, a lot to change, man. Some of the things that you could be dealing with in this faith, health wise, could be, completely turned around, in a matter of one cleanse, because a part of suffering for Yahweh Shem Yahushua is also suffering in food. The elder from Mississippi brought that out. We suffer by doing these cleanses. You ain't never done a gut cleanse in your life. Brothers got to get on that and do that. I believe that. And the elder from Mississippi, saying that in the video, really, shows that the spirit that the men of the Lord are in, man. We ready to suffer because that suffering ultimately helps cleanse out everything that Babylon has screwed up in us. Your gut system, man. Me personally, my gut is screwed up, man. When I was young, I was growing up, eating all kinds of, abominable shit. I'm always eating like ramen noodles, hella hot sauce, hella seed oils, hella fried foods, things that are real harsh on the gut, eating all the damn time. Brothers really, a lot of bros do the OMAD, 1 meal a day. A lot of bros do intermittent fasting. Bros don't really be eating 3, 4, 5 times a day and shit. Okay? And there's times that seasons where you might eat more, but ultimately that's not the status quo. That's not the standard that we run by, because it's not even right. Your body's going to get tired of your fat ass. It's a lot, but, I'm saying this from my own experience because I know myself, man. I can get out of hand with eating too much, man. And that's why I'm saying that because, just keeping it real, your body is like a nagging woman. You be saying you hungry when you're not really hungry. You just want to eat because you're bored, and that does damage. That does legitimate effects, and we got to take care of our bodies, man, because at the end of the day, this hosts the spirit. But, I'm going to drop that. I'm going to get 1 Corinthians 3:16. We're going to end it with that. Lord willing, this was edifying. Just real quick, point, man. We in the times, man, to really, learn our things, learn more, in the truth, and that includes the herbs. You got to know the herbs. You got to know how to, fix problems holistically. That even goes to, even your fit, on your, like, how do I explain this? Like your, if you pull a muscle, it will behoove you to understand the type of stretches and the different workouts, the different muscle groups, to help heal that, part of your body that you might have messed up or that might have been messed up. Jake has a thing, the brother Tazabah goes in this, how Jake has like a pigeon foot, the pigeon foot, it's not just a genetic mishap, it's a weakness, in certain muscles in your body. So in that spare time that you be spending doom scrolling on TikTok or texting that one shorty or, when you really could be putting into learning and understanding the deeper things of, medicines in the spirit, man, because we all got to be like physicians in this faith, man, understanding, the different functions, of the body, because ultimately, man, one day a brother may ask you these things or one day, your child may ask you these things and, what are you going to do? Refer him to Esau? Like, I don't know. So let's just get you some Tylenol or some shit, But, hey, 1 Corinthians 3:16, it says, know you not that ye are this temple of the Lord and that the spirit of Yahweh dwelleth in you? If any man defile the temple of the Lord, shall not the Lord destroy it? For the temple of the Lord is holy, which temple are ye? So we got to do our best of our ability to taking care of the temple, man, to know how to, address these things, I myself first and foremost, because there's a lot of damage in the things that Esau Edom has proposed to us here in this society, man. The ways that, technology affects our eyes, the way that he's, doping up the clouds affects our lungs and our bodily functions, the way that the daily life here in Babylon can actually mess with a man's hormones, the way that, all their food ultimately attacks, it attacks your endocrine system and also your hormone systems, your pineal glands. We got to tap into that wisdom, to, try to correct it to the best of our ability. Because at the end of the day, we're rehearsing the righteous acts. The scripture saying Ezekiel lives like 5 and 8, around there, we shall eat bread defiled among the Gentiles. So you don't got to be over righteous about it, But, to the best of our ability, we abstain from, any presence of evil that we can, We're not out here eating McDonald's. You know, we're not out here popping, pills all the damn time. You know, we trying our best to do better, and rely on the spirit and power of Yahweh Hashem Yahushai. But in the wisdom of the men that he's established here, man. But I pray this lesson was edifying. I want to last to give all honor, praises, and infinite glory to Yahweh Hashem